Were you excited to try out 4K 120 on your a6700 or maybe FX30, but disappointed in how noisy the footage is? There are some things you can do to get much cleaner results in 4K 120 in these cameras, so let me show you. First, let me briefly talk about what happens when you go into 4K 120 mode on the a6700 and the FX30. Instead of getting the full 6K downsample at the full width of the sensor, in 4K 120, it's actually cropping into 3840 by 2160's worth of pixels in the sensor. So it's giving you exactly 4K or UHD 4K, but to do so, it's no longer downsampling from the full sensor, but just punching in to that amount of pixels. So that's why you're getting what amounts to about a 1.5 times crop into the sensor to get 4K 120. In doing so, it's also magnifying the noise that's already present in the sensor. So it's not like giving you more noise, it's just making it much more apparent because you're cropping in to what's already there. So how do we get around it? So let me show you. I've got some test shots here, and just as a baseline, this is shot in S-Log3 s-cinetone at the base ISO, or the low base ISO of 800. I've exposed it for middle gray, so at 44 IRE using a gray card, and you can see the results. So it's pretty noisy. And then just for shits and grins, here is 2500 ISO, which is the second base in S-Log3. Looks like trash, much noisier. And for comparison's sake, here is s-cinetone in the low base of 125 ISO. Looks pretty good, although there's still a little bit of noise there. And then here is the second base ISO in s-cinetone of 400. And yikes, also pretty trashy, very noisy, and a nasty color shift. So that's what it looks like when you use the base ISO and expose normally. There's a couple different ways you can try to minimize the noise. Number one is to just shoot in a lower ISO. So here's the same shot at ISO 200 in S-Log3 s-cinetone, exposed exactly the same way, so for middle gray at 44 IRE. And you can see just how much cleaner this image is. Can't really do the same thing with s-cinetone because it's already shooting at the lowest possible ISO of 125. Another way you can do it is to stay in the base ISO, so at 800 in S-Log3, and then just overexpose as much as you can, and then bring the exposure down in post. So that's what you're looking at here. I set the exposure to middle gray, and then I just cranked the light until the meter on the camera was reading around +2. And then I brought the exposure down in post to match where it was at ISO 200. It seems like in this scenario that the ISO 800 that's overexposed by 2 stops is a little bit cleaner than the ISO 200, but there are some variables that might account for that. Maybe it's just better to do the ISO 800 overexposed, or maybe I did end up adding more light to that one, because you can see the wall in the background is much brighter on the 800 that's overexposed than it is on the 200. But what about some real world scenarios outside? You may hear on YouTube people recommend that you do not go to a lower than the base ISO on the Sony cameras in S-Log3 for 2 reasons. Number one, and most importantly, is that you supposedly lose dynamic range, that you lose quality if you go below the base ISO. The number 2 reason people will say is that you also lose access to the zebras. If you see someone on YouTube who says those things, but they don't actually show you comparisons or actually prove that those things are true, then you can be sure that they haven't actually tried it and they're just repeating something that they've heard. With that said, let's take a look at some more examples shot outdoors. So here's a scene shot at ISO 200. Here's the same scene shot at ISO 800, but overexposed and then readjusted in post. So let me ask you, do you think that there is a difference between these 2 shots in terms of quality and in terms of dynamic range? They look very similar once the exposures have been adjusted. I'm seeing very similar noise in the shadows, and I'm seeing exactly the same dynamic range, seeing exactly the same color reproduction, and exactly the same detail in both shots. And if they're not exactly the same, the differences are so minuscule that they don't matter, especially if you're not A/B comparing 2 different shots. What I think happens, instead of losing dynamic range as you shift the ISO, whether you go below the base or above the base, is the amount of dynamic range isn't changing, but where that dynamic range is sitting is what actually changes. If you just imagine that the dynamic range of the camera as a bucket, or as some kind of container, a box or something. There's all this dynamic range that is possible to capture, but of course the camera can't capture all of it. So the box is sitting in a very specific range of what's possible to capture. At the base ISO, here it is. If you lower the base ISO, the bucket doesn't get smaller, the box doesn't get smaller, it just moves down. So you have less dynamic range that you can capture in the highlight areas, but you get more dynamic range in the shadows. If you go above the base ISO, again, the box or the bucket doesn't shrink, it just moves higher. So you can capture more dynamic range in the highlights, but less dynamic range in the shadows. This isn't true for every possible ISO value in the camera because, of course, The higher you go, the noisier it gets, the more the colors shift. But I think within a reasonable amount of dynamic range, around that base ISO, this is true. As I've shown you and hopefully convinced you, the results between shooting in 800 overexposed by as much as 2 stops versus shooting in ISO 200 are essentially equal. So which one should you do? For me, it's just a lot easier to go ahead and lower that ISO to 200 because what I'm seeing on the LCD is what I'm actually going to capture. And that allows me to just monitor with my eyes how bright I want the exposure to be. Not only that, I can use my zebras at the clipping point so that I'm making sure that I'm capturing as much highlight information as possible and I'm not clipping highlights if I can. Versus shooting in ISO 800 and then overexposing. So for that, you are relying on the meters and the camera to tell you how much you're overexposing the scene by. You also want to make sure that you're paying attention to whether that number is blinking or flashing or is solid. The number won't ever go above +2, but if it's +2 and it's flashing, that means you're overexposed. You want to make sure that it's a solid +2 or lower. With this scene that I'm showing you here, the camera was around a +1.7 to a +2, but never flashing +2. You're also looking at an image on your LCD or your viewfinder that is +2 or +1.7 stops overexposed than what you actually want it to be. That's why I think it's easier just to go ahead and capture at the lower ISO. But regardless, the results should be very similar, if not identical. If you do have the FX30, you also have another option, which is to use Cine-EI. I don't want to get into the specifics of that in this video. It's too complex. I've got another video that goes into pretty good detail about how it all works. So check that out if you need to know. Real quick, another reason people tell you not to go to the lower than base ISO is because the zebras go away. And that's also not true. What happens, like I mentioned, is the allocation of dynamic range shifts downward, so that clipping point is no longer the same as it is at ISO 800. So if you have your zebras set to, say, 98, which is the clipping point at ISO 800 and S-Log3, and then you go down to ISO 200, the zebras disappear because the clipping point is no longer at 98, it's going to be lower. I don't know off the top of my head what that is, but in order to find out, point your camera at a bright light source, the sky, a light, whatever, something that will actually clip, and then go into your zebra menu, go to Custom Zebra, Custom 1 or Custom 2, then set it to lower limit, and then lower the value until the zebras come back. There's your new clipping point. You can do that for any picture profile and any ISO in the camera to find the clipping point. People are undoubtedly going to ask, what do I do in low light situations? Well, don't shoot 4K 120 in low light situations. What I've shown you here is that you really need as much light as possible to overexpose that sensor so that you can bring the noise floor down. If you have a normal exposure at ISO 800, the noise is visible. So what we're doing is lowering that noise floor. We're burying the noise in the shadows, which is what essentially happens at ISO 200 by default, and then what we're doing when we overexpose ISO 800 and then bring down the exposure. We're smushing down the noise floor so we can't see it anymore. If you can't overexpose the sensor, then you can't lower the noise floor, so you're gonna have noisy footage. What people obviously wanna do when they can't add light to the sensor or their aperture is already maxed out and their shutter can't go any lower is they boost the ISO, and as we know, the base ISO is already noisy, so boosting the ISO is only going to make it noisier and noisier. So there are definite limitations to 4K 120 in the a6700 and the FX30, but try to take a glass half full perspective as opposed to a glass half empty and look for opportunities where the 4K 120 is going to benefit you. Obviously, you have a massive crop in comparison to full frame. It's more like a 3x crop. Look for situations where you need a long lens, where you can't get close to whatever it is you're trying to film. Also, why are you even shooting in 4K 120 to begin with? You need something that's going to be interesting, something that's dynamic enough that when you slow it down by 8 times that it actually looks really cool. Not every scenario is going to call for 120 frames slow motion. Sometimes 60 is going to be more than enough. And in 4K 60, you're not dealing with that massive crop. Hopefully that all makes sense, and if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. And also, if there's anything else about the a6700 or the FX30 that you would like to know, please let me know in the comments. That would be super helpful. As always, I really appreciate you watching the video, and maybe I'll see you in another one.